The cabin lights dimmed to a soft amber glow, the kind that made the narrow airplane aisle feel even tighter. The engines hummed beneath us, steady but slightly uneven, as if the aircraft itself sensed the tension that was about to erupt. I sat beside my sister Emma, watching her slowly drift into sleep with her blue blanket tucked under her chin. That blanket had followed her through every flight since she was a kid, its white printed pattern faded but familiar. It wasn't just a piece of fabric, it was the only thing that calmed her nerves during takeoff and turbulence. Tonight, it would become the center of a storm. Across the aisle sat a woman who had already soured the flight before we left the runway. She was around 40, heavy-set, with sharp auburn hair that framed a face carved into a permanent frown. She introduced herself loudly as Brenda. Nobody had asked her name, but she volunteered it while complaining about the boarding process, the temperature, the seating order, and the faint smell of disinfectant. She carried herself with the certainty that everyone around her existed solely to inconvenience her. From the moment she noticed Emma's blanket, her eyes narrowed with the curiosity of someone who assumed everything belonged to her if she wanted it. She leaned forward, peering at it the same way a shopper inspects an item they're debating stealing. I had the immediate sense she would cause trouble, but I hoped exhaustion would keep her quiet. It didn't. The first grab was subtle. I caught it out of the corner of my eye. A quick, testing tug at the edge of the blanket while Emma slept. I turned my head sharply, and Brenda jerked her hand back as though nothing had happened. She glanced at me with wide, faux-innocent eyes, her lips curling upward in a stiff smile that said, "Don't start with me." I whispered, "Don't touch your things." My voice was calm, but there was a warning underneath it. She rolled her eyes dramatically, as if my request had personally ruined her vacation. "It looked like airline property," she muttered. "I thought it was one of the complimentary ones." "It's not," I said. "It's hers." That should have been the end of it. But Brenda wasn't the type to accept boundaries that didn't suit her. A pocket of turbulence nudged the plane, barely noticeable, but enough to jostle Emma awake. She blinked sleepily and adjusted her blanket, unaware of the eyes fixated on it. She caught my gaze and frowned slightly, sensing something was off, but she trusted me enough not to ask immediately. Brenda cleared her throat loudly, the kind of exaggerated cough meant to draw attention rather than clear anything. "I'm freezing," she announced to no one in particular. "This airline refuses to provide adequate warmth." Unbelievable. No one responded. A moment later, she leaned over again, this time more boldly, and reached straight toward Emma's lap. "Hey," I snapped, blocking her hand midair. I said no. Her expression twisted into an offended scowl, as if she were the victim here. "I'm trying to survive a freezing cabin. That blanket is clearly bigger than she needs. She can share." "She doesn't share that blanket," I said. "Ever." Emma pulled it closer instinctively, tension tightening her shoulders. She hated conflict, especially in tight spaces. Brenda seemed to sense that and smiled with a smug satisfaction that made my jaw clench. The flight attendant approached then, perfectly timed, her polished shoes tapping softly against the aisle floor. She was young, composed, with neatly tied dark hair and a crisp navy uniform. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her eyes scanning the three of us quickly. Brenda straightened in her seat. "No, everything is not all right," she said, voice dripping with theatrical outrage. "I'm freezing to death, and these two refuse to let me borrow the blanket the airline provided them." "It's not an airline blanket," I said. "It's my sister's personal item." Emma nodded silently, gripping it tighter. The attendant looked at Brenda and spoke with a tone that mixed politeness with authority. "Ma'am, you cannot take or touch another passenger's belongings. If you're cold, I can bring you an extra jacket or adjust the overhead air for you." Brenda scoffed. "I shouldn't have to wear a jacket like some kind of hiker. And I shouldn't be punished because they're selfish." The attendant didn't blink. "I'm issuing a warning. Please keep your hands to yourself." For a moment, Brenda froze. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she gave the smallest nod. The attendant walked away, satisfied she'd defused the situation. But Brenda wasn't finished. As soon as the attendant disappeared behind the curtain near the galley, Brenda leaned toward me and lowered her voice to an icy whisper. You think you're clever, but you can't stop me if I really want it. Emma tensed again, her fingers curling into the fabric like it might vanish if she loosened her grip. I didn't respond. I simply watched Brenda with a quiet, unwavering stare. She expected me to argue, to escalate, but I didn't give her that satisfaction. I wanted her to realize that any step she took now would be entirely her mistake. 10 minutes passed. The cabin settled into a murmur of soft conversations and humming engines. Emma closed her eyes again, though her breaths were shallow. Brenda shifted in her seat, tapping her fingers impatiently against the armrest. She kept glancing at the blanket, her obsession simmering just below the surface. She wasn't letting it go. That became clear in the tightness of her jaw and the restless twitch of her hands. I remained alert, waiting. Another small tremor of turbulence rippled through the aircraft. A glass clinked somewhere behind us. A child squeaked in surprise. Nothing dangerous, but enough to unsettle the passengers. It was in that fragile moment that Brenda leaned forward once more, her fixation stronger than her caution. Her fingers inched toward the blanket again, slow enough to hide her intent from casual observers, but obvious enough to me. I didn't stop her this time. Not yet. I let my eyes meet hers as her hand hovered over the fabric. She expected fear or frustration. Instead, I gave her calm anticipation, as though I were simply waiting for her to cross the line one more time. And she did. Her fingertips brushed the blanket. That was the moment I knew the conflict was no longer a misunderstanding, no longer a matter of cold air or shared space. It was something deeper, something deliberate. She wanted control, and she was willing to push until something broke. I took a slow breath, preparing for what would come next. And then, from behind us, the curtain shifted. Someone had seen her, and she hadn't realized she wasn't the only one watching. The curtain behind us swayed gently, disturbed by someone shifting inside the galley. Brenda didn't notice. She was too focused on the blanket, too wrapped up in her own need to dominate a situation that had never involved her. Her fingers hovered over the fabric again, as though drawn by an impulse she couldn't control. The moment she made contact, Emma jolted upright. "Stop touching me," she said quietly, but there was a tremor in her voice that made Brenda smirk. "Oh, sweetheart," Brenda replied, her tone dripping with condescension. "You're too sensitive. It's just a blanket." Emma recoiled, and I felt a heat rise in my chest. I leaned slightly toward her, careful not to escalate, but unwilling to let this slide another inch. "You've been warned already," I said, keeping my voice controlled, steady enough to sound like a promise rather than a threat. Brenda shrugged, her shoulders lifting in an exaggerated display of indifference. "Warnings don't mean much when the staff isn't around to enforce them," she whispered, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of doing something she knew she shouldn't. She wanted a reaction. She thrived on the discomfort she caused. People like her always did. I glanced around the cabin. A few passengers were subtle about it, but I could tell they were watching. 2 seats back, a young couple pretending to scroll through their phones. Across the aisle, an older man angled his head just enough to observe without seeming nosy. Everyone sensed the tension, even if they didn't know the full story. Emma shifted the blanket to her opposite side, angling her body away from Brenda. The motion was small but decisive. It was a line drawn, and Brenda saw it as a challenge. She leaned closer, dropping her voice to a hiss. "You're being childish. It's one blanket. One. And you're acting like it's some sacred relic." "It is to her," I said. Brenda's eyes flicked to me. "You're indulging her too much. And you're interfering too much." The edge in my voice made her blink, but she recovered quickly. "Well," she said, leaning back with a self-satisfied exhale, "maybe if someone had raised her to share, we wouldn't be having this problem." Emma's breath hitched. She wasn't crying, but the insult struck deep. I could see her jaw tighten, her fingers curling once more into the fabric. She didn't deserve this, not from a stranger desperate for power. I took a long breath, steadying myself. This wasn't the moment to lash out. Brenda wanted chaos. She wanted the story twisted so she could cast herself as the victim. If I gave her that, she'd win. So I waited. Minutes ticked by. Brenda grew restless. Her fingers danced along the armrest, her knee bounced in agitation, and every few seconds she shot a glare at Emma's blanket. She wasn't done, not even close. Then, without warning, she slammed her fingertip onto the overhead call button. The chime echoed overhead, piercing and sharp. She pressed it again, and again, 3 times in rapid succession, as if summoning an army. Emma flinched. I exhaled slowly, watching Brenda compose her face into a perfect mask of concern. The flight attendant returned, her expression calm but alert. "Ma'am, is there an emergency?" "Yes," Brenda said, her voice trembling with practiced distress. "These 2 have been harassing me." The attendant blinked once, processing. "Harassing you?" Brenda pointed at the blanket. "They're refusing to return airline property. They shoved me when I tried to retrieve it." "We never touched you," I said. "And that's not an airline blanket." The attendant looked between us. Emma nodded, clutching her blanket tighter. The attendant had seen it before, Brenda's first grab, her invasive reach, her refusal to listen. But procedure required her to ask. "Sir, ma'am," she said gently, "what happened?" I spoke calmly. "She tried to take my sister's blanket again." Emma told her no. I told her no. She ignored us. Emma added softly, "She won't stop." Brenda scoffed loudly. "Oh, please. They're overreacting. The cabin is freezing. I was simply trying to stay warm." The attendant stood straighter. "You were warned earlier not to touch their belongings." Brenda huffed. "I didn't touch anything." Passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably. They knew what they'd seen. One woman leaned forward, ready to speak, but I subtly shook my head. Not yet. Timing mattered. Brenda still had rope left to hang herself with, and she was determined to use all of it. The attendant gave her a firm look. "If I receive one more complaint, you may be moved to another seat or reported as a disruptive passenger. Do you understand?" Brenda pressed her lips into a thin line and nodded, but the fury in her eyes burned hotter than before. As the attendant walked away, Brenda muttered under her breath, just loud enough for Emma and me to hear, "You'll regret making me look bad." It was absurd. She was the one making herself look bad. But entitlement rarely recognized its own reflection. The plane settled again. Conversations resumed softly. But the air between us remained electric, humming with unresolved tension. Emma leaned closer to me. "She's going to try again," she whispered. "I know," I said. "And we'll be ready." She swallowed, nodding, trusting me completely. I glanced discreetly over my shoulder. The couple 2 rows back was still watching. The older man across the aisle still had his phone tilted slightly toward us, recording at an angle only someone intentionally observant would notice. People had seen everything. They weren't going to let Brenda rewrite the story. And that mattered. Brenda, meanwhile, stewed in silence. Her chest rose and fell rapidly. Her eyes darted between the blanket, the aisle, and the curtain hiding the galley. She was calculating something, waiting for the moment she thought she could strike without consequence. She shifted forward slowly, inching toward Emma again. Not touching, not yet, just testing how close she could get without drawing attention. Her breath was uneven, driven by a warped sense of justification. When the next mild turbulence ripple passed through the cabin, she flinched, and in that instant, her instinctive motion betrayed her. Her hand shot out, inches from Emma's blanket, before she caught herself. But it was enough. Someone gasped quietly behind us. Brenda froze, realizing she wasn't as invisible as she believed. And then, as if on cue, the curtain behind us parted again. The flight attendant stepped out, her eyes sweeping the aisle with purpose. Brenda sank back into her seat, lips tightening. She wasn't defeated yet, but she was very, very close. The flight attendant moved with a crisp purpose, her posture straight, her eyes sharp as they swept across the passengers. She approached our row with the kind of calm that comes from dealing with countless mid-air crises. But there was a new alertness in her expression. She had seen something, or heard something, or simply sensed that Brenda's patience had collapsed into something more dangerous. Brenda tried to compose herself, but her fingers betrayed her, tapping furiously against the armrest. The attendant stopped beside her seat, folding her hands neatly in front of her. "Ma'am," she said, her voice steady, "I need to clarify something with you." Brinda's eyes widened, then narrowed. "I didn't do anything," she said quickly. "They're lying. They're trying to make me look like." A soft chime interrupted her as someone 2 rows back pressed their call button. The attendant glanced over. The young woman, who had been quietly observing earlier, lifted her hand. "I need to report something," she said calmly. Brinda stiffened. Another chime. The older man across the aisle raised his phone slightly. "Me too," he said. "I think it's important." Brinda whipped her head around, her mouth falling open. "You're all ganging up on me?" The attendant inhaled slowly, bracing. "Ma'am, please remain calm." "I am calm." Brinda snapped, her voice rising. "They're conspiring. They're making up stories to get me in trouble." The man across the aisle spoke again, his tone firm but measured. "Ma'am, we watched you reach for the girl's blanket. Several times." The young woman added, "I recorded it. If the crew needs the footage, I'm happy to share." Emma's breath caught. I felt her grip the blanket in a protective, almost desperate hold. She wasn't afraid of Brinda anymore. She was afraid of the attention, the sudden spotlight. I placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Brinda saw the shift in the cabin, the slow turning of strangers against her, and panic flared in her eyes. "You can't use recordings against me," she sputtered. "That's illegal. You can't film me without permission." The attendant answered calmly, "It is not illegal for passengers to document behavior that threatens safety or comfort. And right now, your behavior is disrupting the cabin." Brinda's breathing turned shallow. "I didn't do anything wrong. I just wanted warmth. I'm a paying customer. I deserve comfort." "You were offered alternatives," I said. "You refused them." Brinda shot me a look of pure venom. "You think you're so noble, so righteous, but you're just manipulating everyone." The attendant knelt slightly, bringing herself eye level with Brinda. "Ma'am, the captain has been informed that there may be a disruptive passenger. I need you to cooperate fully, or we will take further measures." The word captain shattered what remained of Brinda's composure. She glanced wildly around the cabin, evaluating her chances. For a moment, I could see her weighing her options, her ego battling her survival instincts. And then, in a final burst of stubbornness, she did the one thing she shouldn't have done. She lunged. Not gracefully, not strategically, just a desperate, flailing reach across the aisle toward Emma's blanket, fingers clawing at empty air. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence at that exact second, jerking her balance and sending her sprawling halfway into our row. Emma gasped. I caught Brinda's wrist before she collided with my sister. Passengers erupted in murmurs. The attendant stood instantly. "Enough." Her voice cut through the air like a blade. Brinda froze, still halfway hunched toward us, her breath ragged. Slowly, the attendant helped her back into her seat, but there was no softness in the gesture. Just control. "You will not touch them again," the attendant said, her tone low and final. "You will not speak to them again. You will remain in your seat until I return." Brinda opened her mouth, but the attendant raised a hand. Not a word. She stepped back, signaling another crew member. Within seconds, a second attendant approached with a clipboard and a form. The atmosphere shifted. This was no longer just a warning. This was official. "Ma'am," the new attendant said, "we're issuing an onboard misconduct report. You will be met by security when we land." Brinda's face drained of color. Security? For what? For defending myself? This is outrageous. The first attendant gestured calmly toward the passengers holding phones. Multiple reports and video evidence show you attempted to take a personal item repeatedly, ignored crew instructions, created disturbance, and made physical contact without consent. She paused just long enough for the weight of the words to sink in. "This is considered harassment." Brinda sputtered, her voice cracking. "They provoked me. I kept my tone even. We asked you to stop. That's all." Emma added, barely above a whisper, "You scared me." That was the moment Brinda's expression flickered. Not guilt, Just the dawning realization that she had lost the narrative entirely. The attendants escorted her to an empty seat near the front, far from us, far from anyone she could bother. As she walked down the aisle, passengers avoided her gaze. Some shook their heads. Others whispered. A few glared openly. Her arrogance evaporated under the weight of public humiliation. When she was finally seated, the cabin exhaled as one quiet, collective sigh. Emma slumped back, exhausted. "Is she gone for good?" she asked. "For the rest of the flight," I said. "Yes." Emma clutched her blanket and closed her eyes. Relief washed over her features, though her hands trembled slightly. I rested my hand on hers until she steadied. A few moments later, the young woman from behind leaned forward and whispered, "Good job staying calm. People like her feed off chaos." I nodded. "Thanks for speaking up." She smiled. She wasn't as invisible as she thought. The older man across the aisle chimed in quietly. "If the crew needs my recording, they'll get it." For the first time since the tension began, I felt something close to peace settle in. The flight attendants returned to check on us. "You both okay?" the first one asked. Emma nodded, still holding her blanket. "Thank you," I said. "Really? Just doing our job," she replied. "But you handled yourselves well." The rest of the flight passed quietly. Brenda sat rigid in her assigned isolation, her eyes fixed forward, her hands clenched on her lap. She didn't dare look back. As the plane began its descent, the captain announced our arrival. Passengers gathered their belongings. The attendants prepared for landing. And Brenda remained motionless, trapped in the consequences of her own making. When we touched down, the seatbelt sign dinged off. Passengers stood, but the attendants held out an arm. "Everyone please remain seated. We have personnel boarding." The aisle stayed still. 2 uniformed airport security officers stepped onto the plane, moving toward the front where Brenda sat frozen in place. Emma inhaled sharply. I squeezed her hand. Justice had arrived. The final chapter was about to begin. As the plane doors opened and the fresh airport air filled the cabin, Brenda was escorted off first. Her arrogance dissolved into embarrassment, while passengers muttered and shook their heads in quiet satisfaction. Emma hugged her blue blanket tightly, her tan hoodie slightly rumpled, but her relief palpable, while I rested a hand on her shoulder, finally able to exhale. The flight attendants gave us a reassuring nod before moving on to other duties. And for the first time since boarding, the cabin felt calm, almost peaceful. Justice had been served, and karma had its moment. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button, leave a comment telling us what you would have done in our situation, and subscribe for more unbelievable real-life flight encounters. You never know what drama will unfold at 30,000 feet.